Well, here we are together in a way that I really didn't anticipate uh, a few weeks ago. This is a face-to-face section of MC 101, Mass Communication and Society, but thanks to the surgery on my rotator cuff, well, we're having to start things a little bit differently. So for the first few weeks, as I said in the introduction, we'll be working with narrated PowerPoint slides that you'll be watching off of the course website on Moodle. I'm going to presume by now that you have been to the textbook store, to the rental store, and have picked up your copy of the textbook. This is the 11th edition of this book called The Media of Mass Communication. And so the author, John Vivian, has had quite a bit of experience over the years and observing what's going on out in the various mass media industries, and I think has some really good insight into who the mass media are and what they mean to us. You know, by the way, that word media, M-E-D-I-A, from the Latin, media is plural. That means two or more mass mediums, even though mediums is not technically correct. We talk about TV being a medium, M-E-D-I-U-M. Radio is a medium. The internet is a medium. Newspapers, magazines, those books also individually are a medium. But collectively, when we put them all together, when we refer to two or more of these forms of mass communication, we call them media. So, and when we do, we use the plural verb there. We say that if we're talking TV, the medium is very popular. But if we're talking about TV and radio, we would say those media are very popular. So just a little bit of English and grammar to get us underway today. Oops, went too far. Some background on what we'll be doing in Chapter 1, and I do hope that you have read the chapter in its entirety by now. If you haven't, please do so. Remember, I think it's very important that you study the textbook chapter before you listen to my lecture on it, because I will be talking about some things in the textbook that you may not be familiar with. Maybe some terms, some concepts. And so if you spend some time in the textbook preparing yourself, then I think you'll enjoy the lecture more and certainly take more away from it. So, a semester overview. Well, it's more of a Chapter 1 overview, but notice that we begin with a discussion of media literacy. What does that mean? To be literate means to be educated, to be able to, in its common sense, it means to be able to read and to write. And boy, do we ever take that for granted. I'll have more to say about that when we get to Chapter 2 later in the semester. Media literacy, learning how to make sense of the content that the mass media provide to us. Television and movies probably are two really good examples to talk about media literacy. You know, there's a certain way that as we grow up and are exposed to the media, ways that we read the messages of the mass media. TV and film, for example, when we see one scene, if we're watching a comedy or a drama, and we see one scene dissolve or fade into another scene, at some point we learn, we become literate in understanding that that's the way that the storyteller is talking about the passage of time, as opposed to one jarring cut from one scene to another. The dissolve or the fade, we understand that means that some time has passed between the conclusion of one scene and the beginning of another. Well, that's certainly one form of media literacy, and it's a pretty simple one. But the fact is, there's there's a sort of a protocol. There's a way that we learn how to read and react to the content of mass media. And that's one of the things that we'll study at greater length in this chapter. The second item here is not really a bullet point, it's a dash, but we'll consider it a bullet point, and that's media technology. I think it's very important for us we understand, but let's recognize and certainly remember that there are two basic forms of human communication, at least as far as we'll be studying this semester. One of those forms is speech communication, and speech communication, exchanging of words and information among individuals, has been going on, I guess, as long as humans have been on the face of the earth. The mass media, as a form of communication, is much, much more recent, although in its history we trace its beginnings back to the middle 15th century, around 1458 or so. And don't worry about that exact date. I think it's good that we just understand that the mass media had their beginnings around, 500 plus years ago. But in the whole scheme of things, 500 years is a really short amount of time if you compare to the amount of time that humans have been talking to one another. So we talk about the media technology. Mass media, by its very definition, which is coming up in just a moment, the very definition of the mass media involves some type of technology. Early on, that technology was ink on paper, and we actually have an entire chapter, chapter 4, that is devoted to that technology. But then much more recently, let's say within the last 100 plus years ago, electronics came into the picture, and chemical technology also came into the picture. We associate chemical technology with motion picture film, shooting the film and projecting it, and then electrical or electronic technology we would associate with first with radio broadcasting, then with recorded music, then with television, and certainly even more recently than that, the internet and its subset, the World Wide Web. So the important thing to understand is that media technology is very much a part of the mass media, and we will be talking about it at length and in depth throughout the semester, how it impacts the messages that we receive. The third bullet point, media and democracy. Well, we're now, couple of months past the presidential election, but for the past probably 2 years or so, I think that we've had a really good understanding of how our democracy in the United States is so very dependent on the mass media. In fact, it may have gotten to the point long before the election, maybe that you had already had your fill of media coverage of the presidential candidates and those that were running at the federal level, in the Senate, the House of Representatives, at the state level for governor, and even at the local level. We had some races. And the news coverage and the advertising about these candidates and about their promises and about their campaign platforms, we certainly had a lot of information, and a large part of it, perhaps the majority plus some, we receive because we pay attention to the mass media. Now, it is true, I suspect, that speech communication played a large role in this for many people, just people talking to each other around campus or at the office, wherever in the workplace. But nonetheless, the mass media had a very prominent role and continue to have a very prominent role. The news media for a number of years has made the coverage of every little activity of our United States president as something that they treat as news, something that Americans are interested in. And if you pay any attention regularly to the news, I suspect that you understand just how commonplace the coverage of the president's activities really are. That fourth bullet point, media and culture. Well, I think it's pretty fair to say that the mass media have a really important role in shaping the culture. Culture in the sense of who we are, how we behave around other people, the way that we talk, the way that we dress, the things that we do, the things that we're interested in. So much of that information that helps to shape who we are individually, we've learned that by paying attention to the mass media. And later on this semester, we'll expand that discussion. Just a little sort of a sidebar note here. You might not be old enough to have remembered this, or maybe have ever studied it. But there was a time in the United States when our country was king of manufacturing worldwide. We were the people who developed and began building, for example, the first radios and television sets and other forms of electronic communication. But the fact is, today, the United States is no longer the manufacturing power that it once was. I don't remember the exact year, but I know it's been probably 30 plus years since a television was manufactured in the United States. Many of our electronic goods come to us from overseas. They might be sold, represented by American companies, but the manufacturing and probably even some of the design occurs outside of the United States. Now, what's the point of this, and how does it relate to the culture? Well, here's the point. I would say, this is my opinion, that while we in the United States have not been very good at manufacturing for ourselves and for export to other companies, the manufacturing of goods has long since gone by the wayside. But the fact is that the United States is still far and above almost, I guess, every other nation in the world in terms of exporting our media culture. Our recorded music, some of our radio broadcast, and many, if not most, of our TV programs and our movies are well received and respected by other nations around the world. And in fact, and perhaps you've studied this maybe in some other course, the worldview of those of us who are citizens of the United States, the way that other peoples of other nations look at us, what they think about us, what they expect of us in terms of our behavior and attitudes, so much of that was shaped by what they learned about Americans by the way that we are portrayed in the movies. 50 years ago, I think, thanks to television and all of the Western, the cowboy shoot-'em-ups that were on TV at that time, I suspect that the majority of people in other parts of the world thought that all of Americans, all of us, lived in the Wild West and wore six-shooters on our hips and rode horses everywhere that we went, because that was one of the predominant images that they got of us by watching the movies and watching the TV shows. So, yeah, we're not so good at making TV sets anymore and exporting those, but we are very good at exporting our media culture, the depiction of the culture in the mass media, and people in other nations of the world form their opinions of who we are by what we see. And when we get to Chapter 13, Media Effects, we'll flip that around, because I think it's equally important for us to understand that I suspect that much of our understanding of other peoples of the world come from what we have learned by their representations in the media, particularly in TV shows and movies. The next to the last bullet point, and again, this is just an overview of subjects that are covered in Chapter 1 and things that we'll be talking about for the rest of the semester, for that matter, has to do with what we call audience fragmentation. Are you familiar with that word fragmentation? The verb to fragment, to break up into individual parts. And, audience fragmentation has been occurring thanks to the mass media for, perhaps maybe even as long as the mass media have been around. But certainly in the 20th and 21st centuries, as the electronic media really come to take hold and grab so much of our attention, the idea of fragmentation becomes all that more important. Now, hey, look, this is an observation that I'm making. I'm not trying to pass any value judgment. I'm not trying to say that this phenomenon of audience fragmentation is good, nor am I trying to say that it's bad. I'll put it out there. I'll let you make up your own opinion, if you have one about this, as to whether it's good, bad, or indifferent. But let me just acquaint you with the idea that, particularly in your lifetime, which for most of you, if you are a traditionally aged student, your life cycle pretty much coincides with the life cycle of the World Wide Web on the internet. And thanks to the web, the audience, the total number of people that are consuming the products of the mass media are fragmented now more than ever. There was a time, when people like to, as the saying goes, to wax nostalgic, that is to think about the good old days, and I'm talking about those good old days from 30, 40, 50 years ago. There was a time when people liked to talk about family viewing on TV, the idea that there were TV shows that appealed to every family member, that the entire family would gather in the living room in front of the TV and would all be watching the same show together on the same TV. And boy, how long has that not been the case? My guess is that you probably have grown up in a home that has multiple TVs in it. You might have had one in your bedroom when you were growing up, or maybe there was a family room with a TV. Maybe there was one in the kitchen, but multiple TV sets. And probably most of the time, Mom was at one location watching her favorite show, and you were maybe in another location watching your favorite. Brother or sister might have been with you, might have been somewhere else watching something that they were interested in. So that's one example of audience fragmentation. My background as a professional radio broadcaster and educator, when I think of audience fragmentation, I like to think about and talk about the number of radio stations that are broadcasting, both over traditional FM and AM airwaves, but even more today, the number of radio stations that we can listen to over the World Wide Web. And certainly fragmentation began to occur in radio broadcasting early in its history. There's a radio station that broadcast a type of music for almost every musical interest that's out there. And if it's not music you're interested in, you can find stations that focus exclusively on news or on call-in talk shows or on sports coverage. So radio broadcasting as a form of the mass media, very fragmented. Walk into a Barnes & Noble or maybe even into a drugstore or a grocery store, Schnucks, Walmart, Walgreens, CVS. Take a look at the magazine rack and look at the diversified number of magazines that are available for people to buy. There was a time, and it seemed like there was almost, for every interest, there was a magazine that addressed that interest. Well, I'm not so sure that that's as true today as it was maybe 20 years ago. But clearly, magazines are very much a fragmented industry because we all have different interests. And of course, the same goes for cable and satellite television, with the 500 plus channels that are available to us. And I don't know, are you like me? Do you turn on the TV and click around a couple of hundred channels and then decide there's nothing to watch and go back to your tablet or your phone and start looking for something online? Well, so let's just understand. Let's come to this mutual agreement that there is a tremendous amount of fragmentation in the mass media, and the idea of mass media. Think about that for a moment. May be a term that's sort of becoming outdated. To have a mass audience, a large group of people, all at one time paying attention to something. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? Finally, on the bullet point, we need to move on. Media effects. And that's a subject that gets an entire chapter devoted to it. That'll come later in the semester when hopefully we'll all be meeting face to face in Brant Hall at that time. But we certainly will study and question the idea of whether the attention that we pay to the various forms of mass media has any effect on us. And certainly the one that is discussed in chapter 1 of your book that clearly is of importance, and that is advertising. Now, advertising is not a form of the mass media, but it is a type of communication that utilizes the various forms of mass media, mass comm, to communicate a message to us. And that message is to listen up, pay attention, and go out and buy this product or buy this service. These are persuasive messages. Advertisers are trying to acquaint us with their products and services, and more importantly, they're trying to persuade us of the importance of buying and using their products. And they spend billions of dollars every year trying to acquaint us and persuade us to buy products and services. Page 4 of your textbook, what is mass communication anyway? I think any good course probably ought to begin with a definition of the subject of the course. In this instance, it's in our title. Our course is Mass Communication and Society, so it's only appropriate, I think, as we get started, that we take a look at the what I call the textbook definition. A textbook definition is one where every little word in the definition is chosen for its precise meaning. And in our textbook, that definition appears, well, it starts on the bottom of page 4 and continues up at the top of page 5. And in essence, it says this: mass communication, and you can read it for yourself, technology-assisted transmission of messages to mass audiences. Well, in a manner of speaking, that's what I've been talking about for the last, 5, 6, 7 minutes or so, that technology by the very definition of mass communication, technology is inherent in that definition. There must be some form of technology that's utilized in order to convey the message to us in the audience. We may be listening to radio. We may be reading a book or a website. We may be watching a movie or a television program. But in any instance, whether we're watching, reading, listening, whatever, we do this in group form activity, and so we are considered to be audiences. And mass audiences, large groups of people. For the most part, that definition has always held that we typically don't know too many people who form the mass audience. Now, if you want the really exaggerated example of this, and it'll be happening in just a few weeks, another example of it, you take the Super Bowl coverage on TV. Last year, there were something like 100 million people that watched the Super Bowl in 2016. And I think it's fair to say probably two things. Probably all of us watched some or part of the coverage of that game. And outside of your circle of acquaintances and friends and family, my guess is that you did not know personally by name too many more of the approximately 100 million people that were in that audience. So that's probably the largest example of mass audience, but it is a characteristic. It is a characteristic of the mass media that, by and large, when we pay attention in these groups, we don't know personally by name many of the other people who are receiving that same message at the same time. The transmission of messages. The transmission suggests that there is a delivery of the message from the originator of the message to the recipient. Now, those are some fairly precise media-specific terms that I just used, and we're going to get more in depth in that in a future lesson. So I won't dwell on that right now. I do want to focus on that word messages, however, because that is a catchphrase, a catchword, I guess you could say, that's quite often used in the study of mass communication. And a message in mass comm could be a movie, it could be a radio show, it could be something on TV, it could be a book. The content of the mass media are considered to be messages. Commercials are considered to be messages. The content of mass media is in each individual sense, is considered to be a message. So hang on to this idea, this definition of mass comm, because we're going to be coming back to it throughout the semester, talking about it and applying it to the different forms of mass media that we'll be talking about. And once again, that you can find that definition down at the bottom of page 4 and continuing on page 5. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this slide. This is a graphic, a piece of artwork that also appears on page 4, and I would like for you just to take a moment to look at it. And this is a breakdown of the results of a study that was conducted by researchers at Ball State University in Indiana a couple of years ago. And here you can see what it found in terms of our day-to-day, our daily activities, and how many of those activities take place while we're doing other things with the mass media. We may be halfway paying attention to a TV show or listening to our favorite song, might even be reading a book in some instance, maybe while you're eating your lunch or your dinner, and maybe surfing the web or reading a book or a magazine. So you get the idea here. But look at that purple wedge in the lower right hand corner from around on the clock face from around 2 o'clock down to the 6 o'clock position. That time spent exclusively with the mass media. That's almost 4 hours, folks. And that's a lot of time to spend with one activity and to be doing that exclusively. And certainly there are some types of mass media that warrant that we do give it our full and complete attention. Watching a movie, in my opinion, is not an activity that lends itself well to be doing other things, particularly if you're in a theater as opposed to watching a DVD on TV. And I don't know, maybe you're texting during the movie, and I don't know how you feel about that or how you feel about others doing that in the theater while you're trying to watch the movie. So I don't want to get any argument started, so I'll move ahead. Purposeful mass communication. What are the purposes of mass comm? We'll look at bullet point number 2, to persuade. We've already talked about that, the importance of commercial advertising in the mass media to get us to change our minds and buy products that we might not otherwise be inclined to buy. Top bullet point, to inform. Well, that's, in a nutshell, that's news and information broadcasting. news broadcasting to inform us of what is going on in the world. Many times we pay attention to the mass media for entertainment, and much of that time we look to be amused. Sometimes, maybe not. Sometimes we like to watch a good scary movie. We like to be scared by the by the mass media. But the situation comedies and some of the other movies that we pay attention to, we're there strictly for the entertainment value. We want to use that activity as a way to escape from what's happening in our world and find a story that will amuse us and to enlighten us. Certainly there's some content going all the way back to one of the very earliest products of the mass media, which was the Holy Bible, to enlighten our thinking, to educate us, to inform us, to spur our thinking into ways that maybe we otherwise wouldn't be going. Okay? Page 7 talks about the industrial mass media. These are the earlier forms of mass media to develop. I've alluded to some of this already. Newspapers, magazines, and books had their origins 400, 500 years ago. Radio and film both began to develop at about the same time in around the late 1800s to the early 1900s. TV comes along, really makes a splash after the end of that horrific World War II in the 1940s. The very nature of the way they work, the way they operate, we refer to these as industrial mass media, and we'll get much more in depth into that discussion when we get into Chapter 2. I have been teaching courses in mass communication for a number of years, and one of the things that I have witnessed during this time is to see how the forms of mass media have changed, and certainly the World Wide Web, that subset of the Internet, has probably done more to change the mass media than anything since the development of television 70 years ago. Social media is the operative buzzword today. And one of the things we'll talk about in Chapter 7 in New Media, how we use social media to reach out to new consumers, to engage people, to get them involved with products and services. Now, Chapter 3, when we get to media economics, we'll be talking about asking that question. Who owns these media? Both the industrial technology media, the older forms, and the current forms that claim so much of our time on the Internet today. Who owns these mass media? And is it important to know that? And so we'll explore those questions as we work our way through the semester. One of the characteristics of social media that maybe help to differentiate it from the traditional industrial forms is that it seems to be a little more pervasive, a little more present in our lives, simply because there is so much personal information, and it tends to be so immediate. Postings on Facebook, postings on Instagram, Snapchat, even texting. You know, the exchange of messages happens at such a rapid pace with such immediate response. So, I want you to think about that as you think about this question right here. What are the characteristics of social media that distinguish it from the older forms of industrial communication? And I've already alluded to some of those, so I'm going to ask that you think about that as we wind up this lesson